Okay, welcome back everybody to On the Ball, the video podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and our guest today is Carrie Tipton, who is the author of an amazing new book that I've had a chance to read and to talk to Carrie a bit about, called From Dixie to Rocky Top, and it's a history of SEC fight songs. Carrie teaches a sports and music class here at Vanderbilt, and congratulations on this book, Carrie, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and I appreciate your support throughout all the stages of this project.
Oh, absolutely. It's a book that's right up my alley. I wish I could take your class. I would take that every opportunity I could. Before I hit record here, we were talking about an event that we just did at homecoming reunion weekend, your idea of Sounds of the Stadium, where we had the Spirit of Gold marching band, and you talked about your book. We had George Smith, former football player, talking about the role of music from an athlete's perspective. Alyssa Leonard from the Vanderbilt marketing department talking about how music is integrated into the experience of a game. But I just really enjoyed that, and I love the idea you had reminding us that at these spectacles that music is such an important part of the experience. A great experience for all of us that were in the room that day.
Yeah, it really was. And as I was saying to you, Andrew, before you hit record, you could just see and feel the energy in the room shift when the marching band came in and people's faces lit up. You could see that many of these, most of them were alumni, and many of them had some connection with the marching band. And you could just see those memories start. You could just see it unfurl on people's faces. It was really interesting.
Yeah. And this is one thing we talked about that day, but I would love to explore it a little bit more. For you, at what point did you start to make the connections between sports and music? What are some of your earliest memories of those two forces coming together?
Yeah, so I have some early memories of those, although at the time I don't think I was framing them as a clear sports music intersection. Most of my life was lived in the South, specifically in Southeastern Conference states. And I was surrounded by the fight songs of the Southeastern Conference. I heard them on television on Saturdays. My dad and my uncle played in the $1 Million Band at the University of Alabama during the Bear Bryant years, and they would always reminisce about that and sing the Alabama fight song. And then when I was 13, we moved to Starkville, which is where the Mississippi State University Bulldogs are located. And we could hear the marching band from our backyard throughout the week and then on Saturdays. And so the SEC fight songs in particular were just part of the air that I breathed growing up. But then I had another set of interesting sports music memories from an early age, which was that the only years that I didn't live in the South, we lived in Chicago for 6 years, and we were Cubs fans. And so I never missed a Cubs game on WGN radio, would watch them on television. And Wrigley Field prides itself on being something of a traditionalist ballpark, meaning they've had a strong organ presence for many decades through ups and downs, and how the baseball soundscape has changed. That's been fairly consistent at Wrigley. And so just hearing that organ over the radio, sometimes I feel like maybe I was the last generation to get in on that, where all you hear is the organ, the swell of the crowd, the crack of the ball, and the radio announcer. And those imprinted on me pretty heavily. But it wasn't until I was a musicologist, which is kind of a fancy word for a music historian, if you will. It wasn't until I was a musicologist that I realized this could be an interesting intersection to study.
Yeah, amazing. Well, going back to your childhood, like, what were you a musician? Did you consider yourself a sports fan? What did you play back in those days, whether it was an instrument or a sport?
Yeah. So I just have to disabuse anyone listening that I have any athletic inclination or ability whatsoever. Purely a fan. I'm probably the least naturally athletic person that you will ever meet. So it's kind of funny that I ended up doing this. But I am a musician. I play the piano. It's the only thing I've ever played. I've played since I was 3. And it's interesting how the piano figures into my awareness of sports music intersections as an interesting topic of study. When I became a professional pianist in my early 20s, I played a lot of weddings. And I noticed that when I played weddings, especially in the state of Georgia, it was not uncommon for brides and grooms to request UGA fight songs at the wedding. And I would talk to colleagues who were church musicians as well, and they would have the same experience, but at people's funerals. People would request Rocky Top at their funerals because they were UT alums. And That dropped a real pin in my head where I went from just realizing that these songs were everywhere to realizing how important they were to people. And then I connected the dots and said, wait a minute, these songs are so important. They're so formative. They're so emotionally powerful. And scholars have said almost nothing about them as a body of music. And so that the dots connected for me over the last 10 years. And those were some of the early pins that got dropped.
Very interesting. Yeah, that reminds me, at my grandfather Elliot's funeral, we all sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." He was someone that loved baseball and loved listening on the radio, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So you mentioned these different episodes in your life that kind of are the breadcrumbs to leading to you deciding to write this book. Do you remember, like, where you were? What was the moment that you said, okay, this is the book I'm going to write? I'm really going to do this. How did that come about?
Well, I do remember that moment. I don't know if I've ever really told anybody about this. And it requires a little bit of backstory, and I hope I don't embarrass anybody by telling this story. But probably 5 or 6 years ago. So, well, let me back up and say 10 years ago, I wrote an article about this for Deep South magazine. And in the article, I just scratched the surface of just a couple of SEC fight song histories. And at the time, I thought, I really think there's probably a book in here, but I shelved it for lots of different reasons. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I was more seriously considering writing it, but I knew it would be a heavy lift in terms of research, even though I was super interested to get into it. And I was playing for an Anglican church service south of Nashville about 5 or 6 years ago. And we came to a line in a hymn about the Crimson Tide. And the line of the hymn clearly referred to the blood of Jesus. Okay, so this is an Anglican church. I'm at the piano. And this woman in the congregation who seemed like sort of a very buttoned up character, wore dark clothing. I didn't see her smile or emote a lot. I'm not going to say who she's married to because this person is prominent in Williamson County, but in a stage whisper, after we sang the line about the Crimson Tide, she whispered, and half the church could hear her. She whispered, "Roll Tide," as loud as she could. And I was sitting at the piano and I thought, that's it. I have to write these books. These songs, these symbols, these cheers, they are so important to people. And I just think that someone needs to write this book. And so that really was the moment for me that sealed the deal.
And so Vanderbilt University Press has published this book, which is also the publisher of my first book, Strong Inside. Was this like a automatic home run with them? Did you have to convince anybody that this was a worthy topic for a book in an academic press? What was that process like?
Yeah, I actually didn't. They were interested from the beginning. And I think the reason they were interested was that I pitched it in such a way that I think I made a somewhat convincing case that I could write it to appeal to non-academics, but also frame it up academically and hang it on the peg of the history and the historiography of the US South. And I think I had written enough of other things and other places to convince them that I could maybe ride that line pretty well. Mm-hmm. But they were really receptive to it, which I was grateful for.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's a fantastic looking book, in addition to the great content. But before we get into the book, I mean, tell people you're a Bach scholar, right? I mean, like, you're not just someone that only is interested in SEC fight songs and is hanging out at stadiums on Saturdays. What is your other your expertise as a musicologist?
Yeah, so I would say my expertise as a musicologist is definitely American music, definitely US vernacular music. My early research was on Black gospel music in the South. So I have worked for academic and performing societies that specialize in the works of J.S. Bach and his circle for over 10 years. But I would not call myself a Bach scholar because I don't actually produce scholarship in those fields. I just run projects that highlight the scholarship and performance of people in those fields. But yeah, I've worked off and on for the Bach Society of Houston, Texas, and the American Bach Society now for a decade. I'm on the editorial board of the American Bach Society, and that's what I tell people is that came out of my career as a pianist. But it also came out of my doctoral training because I went to a doctoral program that really wanted, even those of us who are Americanists, they really wanted us to have some experience in the Western European classical canon. And so that's kind of a long story, but that's how I came to that. And I tell people that working with English language Bach scholarship, not German language, but English language Bach scholarship the last 10 plus years has only ever made me a better thinker and scholar. And I've also just met a lot of fantastic people. But yeah, I sometimes have to really split my brain in half.
Uh-huh.
You know, you go, okay, Bach didn't write fight song. So yeah, but it's been great.
Yeah. So who did write the first fight song, or where do we go if we're looking at the history of fight songs? Where did this emerge? Why did the idea of having music to accompany a football team, where did that begin? What's the roots of this whole subject?
Yeah. So college football in general, not just the pageantry, but the sport itself, probably many of our listeners know, comes out of the Ivy League. And so Ivy League schools are the first to play the sport, and they're also the first ones to link music and cheering and chanting and yelling to the sport. This would be in the late 19th century, 1860s is about when it got cranked up in the Ivy League. And pretty quickly, students who were not playing the sport were very interested in it, and they wanted to be invested in it. They wanted to have a way that they could participate from the sidelines, if you will. And chanting and cheering and yelling and singing songs on the sidelines became the way that the rest of the student body could participate. And that predates the marching band movement. So yeah, I think the way I explain it to my students is that if you've got a university of thousands of people, and then you've only got, 11 people or whatever out on the football field at a time from your university, you have to have some sense of buy-in or stakes from the rest of the student body. And then you want something also to help alumni feel engaged when they come back, or just fans from the community. And music was a pretty obvious way to do that.
Okay, and you said this predates marching bands.
Yeah.
Now we see the marching band, and it seems like a link to the past in a way,
Yes.
very traditional. At the time that these songs emerged, I mean, that was the way music was played, right? I mean, it wasn't seen as anything traditional. It was contemporary music.
That's right. That's right.
Where did that link come from? Or how did that take place, moving from chants or cheers into actual songs?
Yeah. So they were kind of all coexisting at the same time in the Ivy League. I'm going to talk specifically about Southern football culture, since that's what I know the best. So football came to the South in its college form in the 1890s. And students were chanting, they're cheering, they're yelling, they're using noisemakers. They're starting to sing songs, but they don't yet have the idea that my institution has one or two specific songs. They're singing just a wide range of songs. That's something I talk about in the book. But when SEC schools started to use bands around the turn of the century, where that first came from, really it comes out of military practice. And what would happen was that if there was a military base close by, or just a military ensemble in town, oftentimes they would come to the games and provide that early music. Maybe a couple students would play horn with them or whatever. But the early quote unquote bands in SEC college football, or pre-SEC college football, because the SEC is founded in 1932, and they really come from community band members, military band members. And it's a holdover from the military. That's a way to understand it, from 19th century military practice, where you would have brass bands with a regiment. So, and we're talking about small ensembles, not the scale of marching band that we picture now, like at a Big Ten school or something. But yeah, that was the roots of it.
I got to tell you, it's tough hosting a podcast when you have people trying to barge into your office who also happen to be the athletic director of the university.
Oh my goodness, let her in.
Yes. But I know, speaking of Candace, she came to the event. I know she got in line to get your book, and she's a big fan of it. So I'll put that plug in for her while she's harassing me from outside my window. So there is that connection to military bands. We're talking about the South. There's a connection to the Civil War. And one of the points you make in the book is the also connections to minstrel songs in SEC fight songs. So let's talk about some of that, significant history of race and in the South that plays into these songs. Where do we see that most significantly in the SEC fight songs?
Yeah, so the early years of SEC football, I would say from the 1890s till maybe the 1910s, students are singing a wide range of songs at football games, at parades, and at pep rallies. And when they do have little band ensembles, they're playing, in most cases, a really wide range of songs. And a lot of those songs reflected what was popular in US commercial music at the time. For Southern students, that meant songs that you could hear elsewhere in the country, but it also like drinking songs, folk songs, things like that. But it also meant in the South the use of Civil War marching tunes, in most cases Confederate marching tunes, things like Bonnie Blue Flag, or Maryland, My Maryland. And it also meant the use of blackface minstrel songs. And that's actually why the book is titled the way that it is. So the book is titled From Dixie to Rocky Top. And the reason I titled it that is that Dixie is representative of the very earliest sedimentary layer of football songs that are used at white Southern colleges. So a lot of people think of Dixie strictly as a Confederate marching tune, and it certainly was that. But before it was that, it was a blackface minstrel song. And Dixie is only the best known example of the blackface minstrel songs that I found in my research were sung, were played in some cases in early white Southern football contexts. Other examples of blackface minstrel songs would be some Stephen Foster songs like My Old Kentucky Home or Old Folks at Home, which some people know is way down on the Swanee River. And there were other ones too, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. I mean, it was a constellation of blackface minstrel songs that showed up across pre-SEC schools. These are the old Southern Conference schools that went on mostly to form the SEC. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that those minstrel songs uniformly in their lyrics uniformly look backwards with white nostalgia to the plantation South. And, you know, other scholars had talked about the use of Confederate marching tunes in this early pageantry, but no one else had talked about the use of minstrel songs. And that it was something that just came up enough in the sources that it obviously had to be addressed. But yeah, that's why Dixie is in the title. It is symbolic of that earliest historic layer of the repertory that really did not die out in SEC usage in most cases until the early 1970s. And in the case of the University of Mississippi, later than that.
Right. And with Texas joining the conference next year, I know you've written about The Eyes of Texas and the controversy with that song. For those who aren't familiar with it, you know, what are the issues with that song, and what's the status of it at Texas?
Yeah, so I wrote an article for, at the time, it was ESPN's Undefeated a couple of years ago that really pulls apart the roots of this song. And when I talk about this with my students, I explain to them, you really have to separate the song into two tracks that come out of 19th century musical practice in the US, which is, it was common in the 19th century and early 20th century to take a melody or a tune that was circulating broadly in the culture and put new lyrics to it. So that's what happened with the Eyes of Texas. That's where the Eyes of Texas comes from. The tune comes out of blackface minstrelsy. It comes out of a blackface minstrel song that was initially called the Levee Song, but more people know the tune as I've Been Working on the Railroad. The early first line of it coming out of minstrelsy was, I've been working on the levee all the livelong day. And then that, as technology changes, that becomes, I've been working on the railroad. Okay, so in the early 1900s, blackface minstrelsy was very common on white college campuses. The songs were used all the time, sometimes with the original lyrics, sometimes not. Students would frequently black up and perform minstrel shows. Well, that's what happened at the University of Texas in the early 1900s. They hosted a student minstrel show, which was not unusual. It wasn't unusual for Texas. It wasn't unusual for the rest of the South. And it was not unusual at the national level for white college students to do this at the time. So the University of Texas, I think in 1903, hosted a student minstrel show. And the students took the tune of the Levee Song, or I've Been Working on the Railroad, and they paired it with Texas-oriented lyrics. The eyes of Texas are upon you all the livelong day. And I'm sorry for my singing, but
Better than mine.
And so this is sort of, the song has an interesting history because the tune comes out of blackface minstrelsy, and everyone in the early 20th century who heard it would have known that, would have made that association. And you can see in University of Texas culture, people knew that this was a minstrel tune. That was not some like hidden thing. But I think that historical awareness probably was lost maybe after the 1950s or 60s, and people just started to think of it as I've been working on the railroad. But it's a tough one because insofar as I can tell, there's nothing objectionable in the lyrical content. You know, so it's tricky because it's not quite the same as singing Dixie, where the lyrics are clearly linked to a, you know, regressive, unreconstructed world. But that's not quite what's going on in that song. But it's still, you know, because of its melodic roots in blackface minstrelsy, has certainly become, and I think rightly so, an issue of contention out there.
Absolutely. Okay, so going back in time, let's say to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, how did just the way that people played or shared or learned about music figure into the growing popularity of these fight songs in terms of, you know, sheet music, the radio, record technology? How did those all interplay?
Yeah, so this was one of the coolest surprises to me in the book, is that I was unaware before I started to just saturate myself in these primary sources. I was unaware that there was a time in US commercial music history where college songs were a really viable and popular subgenre of music. Meaning, like what you just said, that you could, in the 1920s or 30s, really up until World War II, you could turn on the radio and you might hear a popular crooner like Bing Crosby or Rudy Valley or Fred Waring singing a college song with their band. In some cases, what we would call fight songs. Um, in some cases, just college themed songs that were popular songs about the college experience or about college life. That was a huge surprise to me. You know, the 20s and 30s are probably the peak of this subgenre. It is like a popular thing in the commercial music industry. And at that time, you could have walked into any music store anywhere in the country, no matter whether or not there's a college close by, and you could easily buy sheet music for college songs. You could buy college songbooks. They would be scored for voice and piano, so you could sit around with your friends and play them at social occasions. You could buy records of hot dance bands, or you could go to campus dances where these hot jazz bands were playing really swinging arrangements of what we would call fight songs, of college songs. And that was really a cool thing to find out to me. And quite a chunk of the book is devoted to documenting this as just a very viable part of the commercial music industry. But what I would say beyond that is that something I talk about in the book is that I think the reason that those songs were so popular was tied to a larger national infatuation with college life as something new and glamorous and exciting,
Hmm.
which, you know, that's just in the era that we've grown up with that awareness. But in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s, you have to remember lots of people are still not going to college. And so any glimpse that the national population can get of the college life, whether it's in college themed movies, musicals, novels, plays, songs, you know, even advertising campaigns, people find it so fascinating that in that era to wonder, what are college students wearing? What are their fashion crazes? What are their dance fads? What are they listening to? What slang are they using?
Hmm.
And so I try to, in the book, I try to frame the college song subgenre as like the tip of the iceberg, like the outgrowth of that American fascination with the glamour of college life.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it was at this period that these songs became solidified as the fight song for a certain school. You mentioned that there might be many college songs. Now we sort of associate one song per school, pretty much. You know, how did
Yes.
that happen?
Yes, that's a great question. So in some ways, the chronological heart of the book is in the 1930s. And there are well, more than two, but a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I think that was the peak of this cultural fascination with college life that was expressed through popular culture, which is everything I just said a couple of minutes ago. But the second reason that the 1930s are the chronological heart of the book is that the Southeastern Conference was formed in 1932, largely from the old Southern Conference schools. And what I found in the sources in that decade was that alumni and students and administrators in the 1930s had a very new and urgent awareness that it was important to build a brand or a sense of PR for your school. And politicians across the Southeastern Conference states also had a growing awareness that if you could bring positive attention to the school's flagship university, in many cases, that's what these SEC schools are. If you can bring good PR to the schools, to the flagship school of the state, that will somehow translate economically into boosting the state's economic prospects. And that's really important during the Great Depression. So what you see in the 1930s, what that translates to for the book's purposes, is that there's a new urgency among SEC schools for identifying and really getting people to learn and use maybe one key fight song. And so the 1930s are the era, is the decade that the majority of the SEC's durable fight songs were either composed or adopted into institutional usage. It's not a super majority, but there are about 6 or 7 of them that come out of that decade that we still hear. And before and after that, the other ones are kind of wedged in around historically. So I think it's enough data to say that that was in some ways the peak of at least the alumni and student and administrator urgency. And, they may not have used the words branding or marketing, but that's what was going on. It was a new awareness that universities need to be sold, that we want to recruit either in-state students. In a couple decades, we're going to be turning towards out-of-state recruitment for the SEC conference. So just really that new and urgent awareness around branding and marketing, even if that's not the words they use in the sources.
Okay, since we're both here at Vandy, I'm going to ask you about the Vanderbilt song in a minute, but the other SEC songs, are there any that stand out to you as having a particularly interesting backstory, or that the lyrics are, unusual or especially evocative of the themes in your book?
That's interesting. I'm going to answer with 2 of them that sort of hit on 2 different parts of that question. The first is that the University of Arkansas fight song has a really interesting story because it was written around 1913, but it was dormant until the early mid-1930s. And during those couple of decades, the University of Arkansas Student Body and Alumni Association worked really, really hard to come up with a fight song that everybody liked. And it's funny that in the mid-1930s, and I wasn't exactly able to piece together how this happened, but the band director at Arkansas in the mid-1930s seems to have stumbled across this song from 2.5 decades earlier, arranged it for marching band, and lo and behold, that's still their fight song. Dun, 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 take that ball right down the field.
Okay.
So that's kind of just kind of an interesting story, but it lines up with that larger historical trajectory that the 1930s are the peak of the anxieties around not having a good fight song.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting. The other one that I would say, you asked about lyrical content that somehow gets at the heart of the book, some of its themes, and I would say Rocky Top. And I'm probably not supposed to say that on a Vanderbilt podcast, but you can bleep me out.
Those words have never escaped my lips on this show before.
We're gonna have to bleep that out if you can do that in post. But Rocky Top's a really interesting story, and people can read the book for more on this. But essentially, it was written by 2 very well-known country music composers in the late 1960s, and it sort of became adopted, almost by accident as a quasi-fight song at the University of Tennessee. Was first introduced in 1972. But the interesting thing for me about Rocky Top is that if you look at the lyrics, they also look backwards, not in the same way as Dixie. I don't, that would be a poor interpretation to argue that, but they look backwards to sort of a pre-modern time. And the lyrics are tongue in cheek, they're comical. But if you look at what was going on in the US South and then broader US culture in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a lot of anxiety about change. There was a lot of anxiety about social change. The US South especially was changing in many ways, kind of the early years of the post-civil rights era. The landscape was changing, the economy was changing. And if you listen to Rocky Top in that light, it's an interesting kind of document of its historical moment.
Oh, wow.
It's also a banger of a song. And
Yeah,
again,
I even have to admit that,
want.
except for the woo part, which I don't like. So, but you mentioned change, and like, it seems that in so many aspects of college sports culture, there's resistance to change. Like if a team were to change its colors, like that would never happen, right? Now teams play with multiple sets of uniforms, but even getting to the point where that was accepted took a long time. Schools don't really change their fight songs, but I mean, has there been an evolution of fight songs at some schools? I know Alabama, they sing Dixieland Delight. That's a big thing in their stadium now. Like, what do you see in terms of either evolution of songs or changing songs? The idea of a new fight song at a school, would that fly? That seems to mean so much to alums as part of that experience of coming back to campus for the game day.
What I notice, and if I had to put my money on a trend, I would say that the innovation that seems to happen now in the college football soundscape, and what I'm about to say I think is probably true nationally, not just regionally, That innovation seems to me to take place in the area of popular music that gets piped into the stadium over the PA sound system. But I'm not noticing any significant addition of new fight songs that are scored for marching band that are presented as somehow part of the institution's core identity and branding that
Right.
alumni and fans would identify with. But I do see innovation unfolding in the area of the PA sound system. And you mentioned a great example of that, where that's something that would not have been really technologically possible, 30, 40 years ago. To
Okay.
pipe in that kind of a song. And, I don't think I talk about Dixieland Delight in the book, but I do talk a little bit about Sweet Home Alabama at
Yeah.
the same school, and
Yeah.
how there is a sense, I think, when these popular songs get played repeatedly and kind of become ritualized, where there's fan or student rituals that go along with the song. I do think in some ways they function as like kind of a quasi-fight song. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Okay. So back to Vandy, Dynamite, Francis Craig. Well, can you tell us about this band leader who wrote that song, and how did Dynamite become the fight song here at Vanderbilt?
Yeah. So if people want to know a lot more about Francis Craig, I actually did a talk for the Tennessee Historical Society a few months ago. And if you want to, I can send you a link that you could put in the show notes, because it's on video and people can go see it, where I really delve into his history quite a bit more than I did even in the book. Francis Craig was a band leader who was active in Nashville and beyond. He was based in Nashville, but he had certainly a regional presence. He had a little bit of a national presence too, through radio play and touring. But he was a band leader, dance band leader, in starting from the late 19 teens through, really right after World War II is when the styles of music changed and his career sort of wrapped up. And during that time, he led what we would think of as, some people would call it probably big band music, dance band music. He was more on the sweet side of the sweet hot jazz binary, although that binary can have its own kind of problems. But so he had gone to Vanderbilt. I don't think he graduated. There's some disparity in the sources about that, but he went to Vanderbilt and he started his dance band at Vanderbilt. And he left Vanderbilt, I think around 1920 or 1921, to pursue a full-time music career. But since he remained rooted in Nashville his entire professional life, and because he was very close to the Vanderbilt community, he continued to be a strong musical presence on the campus. And what I mean by that is that there's lots of primary source evidence that he played tons and tons of Vanderbilt dances in the 20s and especially the 30s, of fraternity dances, sorority dances. He also played regularly at the Belmead Country Club and at the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville. Those were two of his longstanding gigs. And Vanderbilt students, because of the social class that they were, they went to the Belmead Country Club and they went to the Hermitage Hotel dances. So these social institutions were kind of linked. And Francis Craig and his band were right at the heart of that. He also played on WSM radio quite a bit, not just where you could hear him regionally, but he was picked up, I think, by NBC, did a hookup with him for many years with WSM. So he gets to have some, okay, all that to say is Francis Craig was really tied into the commercial music industry. He was also tied into Vanderbilt campus culture, and he knew what students liked. And by the late 1930s, Vanderbilt still did not have one single song that was really being used consistently. They had tried and sort of discarded, not officially discarded, but sort of dropped informally, a number of different songs since the early 1900s. And Francis Craig knew that because of his closeness with the student community. And the way that Francis Craig has told the story on a radio interview that I heard, archival radio, is that he said that he was approached by Vanderbilt students who asked him to write a fight song for the university. Now, he was reminiscing about that 20 plus years later. And so sometimes people's memories are a bit faulty. But in 1938, the week of the UT Vanderbilt game, he wrote Dynamite. And I think the reason that he was able to help it catch on so quickly was that he was so tied in to campus culture and to the commercial music industry. So Dynamite was probably first played by his dance band on radio the Friday night before the UT Vanderbilt game. And many, many people would have heard it regionally. That was not, we're talking about WSM radio with a massive 50,000 watt reach in this era in the late 30s. So the song gets introduced probably on the radio that Friday night before the UT Vanderbilt game. And then the next day, there's some evidence that the Vanderbilt band had an arrangement of it. Francis Craig may or may not have conducted it, but it had already been arranged for band. And I've also found evidence in the University of Tennessee archives. And this is kind of interesting just to see how these paper trails can drop, like some crumbs for you. This woman who went to the University of Tennessee, she was a student in the late 1930s. She went to the Vanderbilt UT game, and she put back in her scrapbook materials a really the earliest print that I've seen of Dynamite. And it was just the melody with the lyrics, and it was printed as a broadside, meaning like one single sheet of paper. And the Ace gas station sponsored it in Nashville. And these were pieces of paper that would have been distributed to the Vanderbilt students so they could learn the song that day and sing along. So even though the band was going to play it, there was still an expectation in the late 30s that the student body would actually learn and sing the words. That was a huge value in student culture for many, many decades, is that you show up to the games and you sing the fight songs. You don't just let the band carry the sonic burden. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Vanderbilt song's got a cool story, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right. So that idea of going to a game and participating in the songs, like what would it be like for someone to go to a game with you? Like, are you someone that is watching the band more than the action? Are you singing along with the songs? You've talked about soundscape. Like, what are the sounds that you're listening for beyond the fight songs in the band if you're at a game on a fall Saturday?
Well, ever since I started this project, it's been really hard to turn off my scholar ears and my scholar brain. And so when I go or when I watch on television, I'm really intaking so much sonic data that sometimes I get overwhelmed. Sometimes I find the games themselves super, super loud. But the thing that stands out to me is that when you're there in the moment, especially when you're physically there in person, a lot of what we're talking about just sort of dissolves into like this big sonic mass. You're not necessarily hearing the entire fight song from front to finish. You might hear a phrase of it peeking out of the texture here and there. You might hear the drunk guy next to you, yelling a word that you don't want your kids to hear, and you're like covering up their ear. You might hear at Vanderbilt, you might hear the sound of the horn over there's just so much sonic stimulus. So in some ways, I think the book presents like this very sanitized idea that we hear fight songs from front to back all the time, and you can hear all the words, and that we all know that's not really what happens in the heat of battle, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. All right. If a student takes your course, what are they learning? Like, I just think that's so fascinating that there's a class on sports and music. What are the different themes or topics that you discuss in that class?
Yeah, so when Vanderbilt first asked me, can you develop a class loosely rooted in your research, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't get a whole class out of I'm not just going to teach my book. And it was a stretch for me. I mean, I never had any graduate courses in sports history or anything. And I just really had to sit down and draft out, what seemed to be some interesting sports music intersections that we can study. And so sometimes I move through specific sports, and sometimes I move thematically in the class and look at different social and cultural themes. So when I move specifically by sport, another example of sports music intersections that we look at beyond college football and fight songs and bands would be the organ tradition in baseball parks. And that's been something that's been really cool to get into. And I always try to have my students engage with primary sources related to whatever unit we're looking at. So when we come to the baseball music unit, we look not only at the organ tradition, but we also look at early sheet music from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that and we treat it as like a historical primary source that can tell us a lot about early baseball fandom and culture. And that's really cool. The Library of Congress has a really cool set of digitized, couple hundred, I think, digitized early baseball sheet music. And I have my students get into that database, and they answer very specific they choose a piece of sheet music, they work with it, and they learn to treat it as a historical primary source that can tell us a lot about the sport and just as an American phenomenon in at that time. When we move thematically, sometimes I'll take a theme that I just find particularly interesting, like the concept of regional identity in sports. That's obviously a huge interest of mine. And then I tried to sort of retrofit or retcon a sports music intersection around that theme that would make an interesting case study. So recently, we just came off a couple weeks ago looking at regional identity as it relates to NASCAR and country music. So
Wow.
sometimes I'm moving by sport, sometimes I'm moving by theme and finding a sports music intersection. But I will tell you that, every couple of days, somebody is sending me some crazy like TikTok or streaming where there's just some wild sports music intersection that I think, how do I work this into the class? I just want to have a day where I show all these crazy clips that people send me, because once you take it seriously as an avenue of intellectual inquiry,
Yeah.
there's a lot there.
I remember we were sharing a video among the two of us when Harry Styles was getting the crowd to call the Hogs when he was
Yes,
singing in Arkansas,
yes,
right?
exactly. Stuff like that. Stuff
Yeah.
like that. Or, just yesterday, a student was telling me about the new PBS documentary about the disco panic and the Chicago White Sox, where they had
Yes.
the day where people
Yeah.
came and
Disco
burned the
Demolition
disco
Night.
record.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the documentary, but I knew about that moment. And what a great, micro case study to get students to think about, reactionary white working class sentiment and how it was expressed culturally at that time. And
Absolutely.
I think that's kind of how I treat sports and music in this class, is how can we use it as like an inroad or a foothold to larger social and cultural and historical issues that I personally find interesting.
Yeah. I have one of my books is a biography of Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. He was African American, and he was playing at that time, the Disco Demolition Night had. And I have a chapter in my book about how that represented kind of a cultural backlash to forces behind disco that are coming from Black and Latino gay culture, so that was a fun chapter. Troy, I'll have to
Yeah.
share with you, see if it passes muster from a musicologist
Oh yeah, no, that's great.
standpoint.
That's really good to know about. I'm glad you told me. I'll actually definitely look at that for my
Yeah.
class. I'm always looking for stuff that's, in many ways, stuff that's written not by academics is a better fit for this class. It's not a graduate class. It's not an upper level class. And oftentimes, journalists are, to be honest with you, kind of, they produce clearer, more incisive writing. I probably have to bleep that out too, but.
That's right. Okay, congratulations on this book, From Dixie to Rocky Top. For those who are interested in purchasing the book, where can they find it, and where can they learn more about you? If they're interested in having you come speak at an event, I imagine this would be perfect for any alumni gathering of any of the SEC schools or book clubs around the region. How can people find you? How can they find the book?
Yeah. So the book, you can go to the Vanderbilt Press website and it will be listed there. And Vanderbilt Press is often running some type of a discount. I think right now they have a 40% off fall discount, although I don't remember the code. That should be on the website. But also I would say pretty much any independent bookstore that you want to order from, because they all use the same couple of central, distribution sources. You can order this book from, I've had people order it from indie bookstores in Athens and Birmingham, pretty much any indie bookstore. It is on some bookstore shelves. I've been told that it's on at Novel Books in Memphis, for example. There was a sighting recently that was exciting.
All right.
But if you call up your local indie bookstore, love to see people support indies, absolutely. In terms of finding me, you can email me through Vanderbilt's Blair School of Music website, but also you can go to my own website, which is carrieallentipton.com, and there's a contact button. And I've tried to be good about kind of listing on my link tree when I have things coming up, and I've probably fallen down on the job for that. But I've been on a couple podcasts that you can tune into, and I was on South Carolina Public Radio a couple days ago. Get that out soon. So yeah. And just for anyone listening, the book also covers the former SEC schools. So it also covers Tulane and Georgia Tech and Swanee. So I'm happy to come talk to those alumni groups too.
Well, that's terrific. Well, it's a great book, great achievement. As someone that's interested in sports and culture, again, it was right up my alley. I'd love to take your class too. But congratulations, Carrie. I encourage everybody to check out the book, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. Thanks so much for having me, Andrew.
All right.